Okay, welcome everybody. I think we've done it. I think we are now live and people are starting to join us in our event. Welcome everybody to our event with John Albers and David Perry, the authors and photographers of Growing Conifers. We're really excited to have them here with us today, and we're excited that you are able to join us. So welcome, my name is Sarah Reeves and I'm the marketing manager for New Society Publishers. We would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the unceded traditional territory of the Sunamo First Nations, and that we are welcoming attendees from a wide range of territories. As we speak about conifers today, I want to shed light on some mighty ones that make up our remaining old growth forests and acknowledge the cross-section of citizens, including Brittany, who is working behind the scenes on an event today that have been standing in resistance on Pajida territory of the Fairy Creek blockade. This is a non-violent act of civil disobedience that has stopped Teal Jones from building roads and logging old growth trees in the last unlogged old growth valley on southern Vancouver Island for the past 300 days. Not all of us can be at the front lines, but we can all do something. You can find out how you can take action in our blog today, and we'll add the links to the chat and onto our Facebook Live. The past year has been a challenging one on a variety of levels, but it's also brought lessons of community building, resilience, self-sufficiency, food security and equity, and diversity to the forefront. New Society Publishers remains committed to bringing you books that offer positive solutions for troubled times. We're proud to hold the highest environmental and social standards of any publishers in North America. You can find out more about our sustainability practices in the link in the chat. So this is the last of our spring gardening series, but we're planning more for the fall. So if you would like to be kept up to date on upcoming events, you can sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social, or follow us on our Eventbrite. And Brittany will add the newsletter sign up into the link. And you can find us through all your favorite social channels. We would like this virtual experience to be as interactive as possible, so please let us know where you are joining from and post comments in the chat. At the end of the talk, if time remains, John and David will answer some of the questions posted, and we will give away a copy of their book, Growing Conifers, by choosing one of the posted questions in the chat comment section. So be sure to participate for your chance to win. As well, one of our Zoom attendees will be randomly selected to win a subscription to Harrowsmith, Canada's premier magazine on everything rural, organic, and green. And finally, we invite you to enjoy a 25% discount on Growing Conifers using the code Conifers25 on our website, newsociety.com. So you can use that and receive 25% off this beautiful, full color, gorgeous book. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John and David. John Albers is an educator for the Washington State University and Landscape Association, a certified sustainable landscape professional, a former master gardener, and the creator of Albers Vista Gardens, which contains over 1,200 different plants. And he's also the author of the Northwest Garden Manifesto and lives in Bremerton, Washington. And David Perry is a professional photographer who has photographed for books, including the Northwest Garden Manifesto, magazines, Fortune 500 reports, and national ad campaigns for over 35 years. And he lives in Seattle, Washington. So please join me in welcoming them.
Okay, there we are. This, although I always loved like conifers, my love for conifers really blossomed as I began to develop my botanical garden over the last 22 years. Now this is a sustainable garden because it endures over time without excessive expenditure of resources and maintenance, while at the same time it enhances biodiversity and creates habitat for wildlife. Now, conifers are an important part of this botanical garden because, number one, they are long-lived, they are drought-tolerant, and adaptable to a wide variety of conditions. This shows a new portion of the botanical garden. On the left, you see a large coast redwood. This redwood was to be cut down by the owners, and we decided that we had to save this redwood. So on the right shows a transformation of this particular part of the botanical garden. Looking west, to put it in context, you can see the Puget Sound or Sally Sea in the background, and then above that in the background, you see the snow-capped Olympic Mountains. We removed all the lawn and vinca from this particular area, and it's been now replanted with drought-tolerant perennial shrubs and a host of a number of dwarf conifers. Conifers provide a wealth of benefits to both us and wildlife. They provide many advantages to the urban environment. Number one, they remove carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, and consequently during photosynthesis, they produce oxygen. This helps combat climate warming. Furthermore, they slow down the rainfall with their dense foliage, thereby minimizing stormwater and erosion. Their dense foliage also removes air and water pollutants year-round. They conserve energy and water and cool the air through evaporation and shading. They do all this while enhancing wildlife habitats.
So, John and I bring very different sensibilities to this storytelling project. Now, John's a scientist through and through. And fortunately for all of us, he's a scientist with a wonderful aesthetic eye, which is quite apparent from his garden. I grew up as the son of a zoologist, so I was surrounded by scientists and universities as well. And although I love the world of science, I was kind of the weirdo in my family who ached to find a way to make a living as an artist. So where John is more of an artistic scientist, you could say that maybe I'm more of a science-y artist. We've done our best to create a book that will help you with many of the tricky questions. Conifer selection, planting, pruning, diseases, all that kind of stuff. But there are other considerations that really should be considered as well. Which means, well, let's put it this way in a very unscientific question. I can get away with asking questions that perhaps John can't. I can ask silly questions. I can ask poetic questions. Questions like, do you feel the love? Now, what do I mean by that? You can love conifers for their needles. That's just kind of a given, an absolute. There are so many variations in needle form, length, color, texture. Some conifers even come pre-frosted, like this Kohut's icebreaker, which is really a stunning specimen. And then there's the blues. I mean, could you name a sad-looking tree anything better than the blues? So as someone who's been hanging out with and listening very carefully to conifers for the past few years as we've been putting this book together, I can say with absolute confidence, conifers definitely have personalities. You might not get a scientist to cop to a thing like that. Wink, wink. And so when you choose a conifer for your garden, that tree's personality is definitely going to make an impression upon the look and feel of the garden, which is wonderful. You might love conifers for the way they make everything else in the garden look better, even snow. Or you may adore conifers for the homes, the food, and the shelter they provide wildlife, making your garden even more of a bird magnet and an ecological oasis. Obviously, no one could fault you for adoring the ways conifers enlarge your imagination or encourage you to look up. Maybe it's that iconic look that some conifers bring to a garden scene, like this Serbian spruce that stands as a beacon no matter what the weather or the season. To me, this kind of looks like a tall, thin pagoda. Whatever that magic thing about a particular conifer that grabs your heartstrings, somewhere in the mix, there will inevitably be cones. Yes, cones. I mean, just look at all the possibilities. Cones really are the flowers of the conifer world. We discuss cones in depth in Chapter 1 and cover all sorts and shapes and manner of cones. And of course, we feature the wonderful visual appeal that cones add to many garden scenes throughout the entire book. Is it just me, or do you too see an ornate candelabra with red glowing candles in front of a stained glass window? Korean fir cones have served as something of a gateway drug for me and utterly capture my imagination. We decided to show them in every season and stage of development within the book on pages 24 through 27. Here is a cluster of young cones in early May in John's garden, and then the exact same cluster 6 months later in late October. And here are Korean fir cones in a snowstorm in early February, and then having been frozen solid for a few days and had that pitch sort of squeezed out of them, you can see again in late February. And here's a Korean fir in mid-October backed up by a Japanese maple. And then again, in early May, these are what's left after the birds eat all of the seeds in the cone. So now I'm going to hand it back to John.
Okay, thank you, David. May I have my next slide? Continue. Can we go back to the next slide, please? There we go. I think as David pointed out so well, the conifers offer unique forms, colors, and textures that are not evident in deciduous plants or broadleaf trees. As a consequence, conifers blend and complement other plants in the garden, thus enhancing the beauty of the garden. Next slide, please. This shows another part of the garden called Sam's Conifer Reserve. Sam was a young man who came to me at the young age of 14 to volunteer to work in the botanical garden. Sam was unique in that he already was in love with conifers at this young age. He continued working through his high school days, and he also received an associate's degree at age 18. Soon thereafter, he had the opportunity to have a job working in a large nursery that focuses particularly on conifers and maples in Oregon. And Sam, of course, is in love with his work because it focuses on conifers. Next slide shows a close-up of Sam's Conifer Reserve and point out some of the wonderful conifers shown in this photo. In the middle photo, we see dwarf dawn redwood called Miss Grace. And on the right, you see the bright yellow new growth of Taylor's sunburst shore pine, lodgepole pine. Then on the left, we see another interesting looking yellow conifer called Frankie's Boy, Thuya orientalis. Now, the botanical garden showcases many kinds of plants, including 130 different species and over 400 different conifer cultivars. Having experience with many different conifers and different garden settings, I've come to the conclusion that they are ecologically versatile because they can live in a broad range of habitats. And on the next slide, you can see that they can withstand, next slide, bitter cold or deep snow, or alternatively, they can deal with areas that are arid with little water, such as this Great Basin bristlecone pine. And some conifers also can do well in shady conditions or in wet conditions. In the book, we outline all the conifers that can deal with different conditions that you might experience in your garden. Because of their wide ecological versatility, they are suited to almost any garden in the temperate regions of the world. Next slide. Conifers exist in many forms. And if we, next slide, including columnar form, as this Italian cypress on your left, or they can exist as ground-hugging pancakes, as you see the two junipers that front this large red Japanese maple. Or they can, next slide, exist as a form of globes, as this Hebe arbor vitae. Or they can be perfectly symmetrical cones, as this European silver fir on the right. Next. They also vary widely in colors and textures. Next slide. This shows some examples of blue conifers. You see the Atlas cedar on the left, and then the wonderful blues of the Colorado spruce on the top right. And then we have R.H. Montgomery Colorado spruce on the bottom right. Next slide. They can also range in a variety of yellows depending upon the season. We see on the top left the beautiful Pseudolarix amabilis, or golden larch. And then below, left, right, on the left bottom, we see the Sicilian golden fir. And then next to that is the amber flickers spruce in front of the large Abies spindro. Then on the right, we see the lodgepole pine, Chief Joseph, in the winter time, having bright golden yellow, brightening up the winter garden. Next. I think David is now to begin.
Go ahead and talk about these for a minute, John, and I think it's the next slide we jump over.
Okay. Well, there's many variations of color. Certainly on the left, we have the striking Ingle spruce called elegans. And then there's many, many examples of varied shades of green on your right. Next. Colors change through the seasons, and I think David is going to address this.
Okay, so although many people already know about this, I suspect that there are at least some of you out there that don't really understand that seasonal transformations are a crazy good reason to include conifers in nearly any garden. John was just talking about varied textures and colors in conifers, but how many folks are aware of the profound changes that come over certain conifers as day length and prolonged temperature changes turn chemical switches on and off within them. You see that purple tree? It's pretty much green during the summer. And behold the radiant wonder that is Chief Joseph, lodgepole pine. It too is mostly green in summer, but come those short, cold days of winter and shazam, it's pure magic. And here you can see another Chief Joseph lodgepole pine, this one in my garden. That color doesn't fade out right away when winter's over. You can see here, my lodgepole pine is standing in front of a rhododendron in full bloom, and it still has its color. It really starts to shift back towards green as the new needles come in. Now, one last thing before I hand you back to John, I want to touch briefly on using conifers as design elements within the garden, because this is another real aesthetic, maybe not so scientific, but very much aesthetic, artistic rationale. Remember how I was saying that conifers have personalities? Well, check out this Japanese black pine. No rigid, upright soldier this. It's all about the curves. To me, this feels like a sumi painting, the fluid strokes of brush and ink on paper. And look at how this pendula bruns rises up out of a sea of heather. I mean, to my mind, that's just magnificent. It all looks like it's connected, very, very poetic. So what we want you to think about, we want you to think about color, and we want you to think playfully. Look at this Bush's lace spruce that John paired with a purple ornamental plum. That pairing was no accident. Okay, so John's going to take it from here, expanding a bit more on leaves and cones and conifer textures, discussing their many uses in the garden. But before I hand you back, I want to remind you once again of that poetic question that you should definitely make your own when considering conifers for your garden. Do you feel the love? Choose trees for your garden that you love looking at, that you love touching, that you want to be near on a regular basis. Okay, John, take it on home.
Point that the leaves of conifers can change dramatically through the seasons. As we mentioned about Chief Joseph in winter and green in summer, and then the opposite, of course, the lodgepole pine Taylor sunburst is bright green in the winter, but in spring comes along, it shoots out with a beautiful yellow new growth. And on the next slide, you can see ruby teardrops. The Colorado spruce has bright cones on the tips of almost every branch. And these are, of course, seed cones. While on your right, we see a profusion of pollen cones on the Caucasian spruce skylands. And the next slide, we show texture differences. Conifers can go from fine to coarse texture. We see a good example of fine texture on your left, the Deodar cedar cream puff, and on the right we have a coarse textured conifer called Athrotoxis laxifolia from Australia. So conifers can, forms, colors, and textures contrast nicely with the deciduous plants. So we're going to talk now about the many uses of conifers. Because they take many varied forms, they can serve many different functions. On this particular slide from my garden, you can see the Cryptomeria japonica in the background, serving as a structural backdrop. And on the next slide, we can see a variety of conifers serving various functions in this beautiful multi-layered plant community. You can also have a conifer sheared in form of a hedge in this particular photo. And on the next slide, we see a group of emerald green arborvitae serving as a wonderful windbreak and privacy screen. The conifers, particularly vertical conifers, columnar and columniform, can serve as wonderful focal points, as the Italian cypress on your left are the narrow growing Engelmann spruce bushes lace on the right. Conifers serving as ground covers, as this golden form of juniper on your right are the green juniper communis on your left, surrounding the blue pyramid cypress. Conifers, since they are slow growing, they can also be wonderful plants to add to your containers, as the pine, Louis, eastern white pine in David Perry's garden. Now we want to talk a little bit about selecting your conifers. We have a whole chapter that discusses this issue. The first step is to, believe it or not, is to know about the different zones in your garden, whether they're sunny or shade, how much sun, how good is the drainage, etc. And then you want to know your culture requirements of your conifer, because the key point in selecting your conifer is to match your conifer to your specific site in your garden. Because you want to ensure that your chosen conifer will thrive in your specific microclimate. So if you're not sure about the information on the culture requirements, you can also consult with your nursery where you plan to buy your conifer. Although many conifers do well in sunny conditions and good but not excessive drainage, many conifers can break this mold. Some can do well in wet areas, some can do well in particularly dry areas, and others can do well in sun, while there are a number of conifers that do perfectly well in light or dampened shade. So regardless of your conditions, you can generally find a conifer that matches your garden site. Before we get into planting, I do want to make the point for selecting your conifer. You want to select a conifer not only has interest year-round, but you like to have it fulfill some particular function in the garden. So you select a conifer that blends naturally with your other plants in the garden and fits the scale of your garden as it reaches maturity. So a key point in selecting your conifer is to make sure you know its growth rate. Then your next step, of course, planting your conifer. Now, the key to success in planting your conifer relates to planting time. Generally, you can plant conifers from containers in any time of the year and have success. But I recommend that the best time to plant your conifer is when they are dormant, because this minimizes transplant shock at the time of planting. So this means that if you're in a mild climate like the Pacific Northwest, you would plant your conifer in late fall through late winter. However, in colder climates, where the ground is frozen hard in the wintertime, you may need to plant your conifer in early fall or early spring after the soil falls. Now, the details of how to plant a conifer is explained step by step in a chapter in the book. I think the key point to remember is that during planting, you want to expose your feeder roots to your native soil and not plant your conifer too deep. This means that the root flare should be slightly above the ground level of your planting site. So let's go on to the next slide. This is caring for your conifers. This is again young Sam Pratt, conifer expert who volunteered in my garden for many years and still is a volunteer, although he lives in Oregon, and he's removing a dead branch. Normally, conifers need very little pruning, but it is important for health is to prune off dead, diseased, or broken branches. The other aspect of conifer care requires the use of integrated pest management as principles for prevention, monitoring, and management of your conifers. So this means you need to monitor your conifers on a regular basis for damage or disease. And once you are aware of this, you want to identify the pest or cause of the damage. Once you have established this, you want to take a plan of action, but it's important using integrated pest management to take effective action using the least toxic method to control the problem. And in the book, we outline in detail all the common pests and diseases that conifers can be exposed to help you deal with these issues. Our urban gardens provide an oasis in which to relax and enjoy the wonders of nature and the rewards of gardening. Furthermore, they are an important link to the broader ecosystem. Now, adding conifers to our gardens and green spaces can make a big difference in our urban environment. They not only add resilience and beauty to the garden, but as we've heard, they are aesthetically, functionally, and ecologically versatile. They also provide a host of long-term ecosystem benefits by cleaning the air and water by removing pollutants year-round, slow and absorb rainfall to minimize runoff, capture carbon to help diminish global warming. They conserve energy and water, and they do all this while enhancing wildlife habitats. They also provide us with nurture our physical and mental well-being by providing green infrastructure. All these benefits are essential to our own health. I hope you share my passion for these exceptional plants and then make plans today, therefore, to plant a conifer in your garden and order the book to help you along the way. Growing conifers can make the difference in making it easy to get your conifer planted and have it grow a successful long life. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, David and John. That was excellent. I've always loved conifers, but now I have even more respect for all they do. We want to take some time to take people's questions, but first, I think we're going to, just let me check with Brittany if we're going to do our giveaway. Here we go. So the winner of Growing Conifers, this beautiful book, is Jack Rosian. And so we'll be in contact to get your address and get that book to you. If you live in US or Canada, you'll get the hard copy. If you're overseas, we'll send you the ebook. And the winner of our Harold Smith subscription is Martine Fabrice. So again, we'll be in touch to get your contact information. And don't forget, everybody can get this beautiful book today with a 25% discount on our website using the code Conifers25. So I want to take some questions that came in, if that's okay with the two of you.
Absolutely.
We have a question here from Charles. A large white pine on my property along the, I'm going to maybe say this incorrectly, Cacapon River in West Virginia, spontaneously fell, breaking many of its roots in the process. Do you have any idea what could cause this?
You say its roots were broken?
Yeah.
Well, I think we need a little more information. What type of soils and what other?
Right. So there's a variety of things.
It's hard to come up with an answer without knowing more information about soils and the type of.
Fair enough. So
white pines, are not generally subject to wind throw as some other conifers. So it's a very unusual event for this to happen for a white pine unless there was some issues with the soil or planting site or the conifer itself.
Okay, fair enough. So there's lots of different things that could affect the health of the roots causing it to fall. So we would need a bit more information.
I mean, it's hard to say. He doesn't say about the health of the tree or whether it had
Right.
root rot. All those are possibilities that
Okay.
could explain this happening.
Okay. Okay, well, let's move on to another question. Is it true that a group of conifers in a given area are actually connected in such a way that they actually can communicate with each other in terms of sharing the ground resources available to them?
Yes. And the short answer is yes. Mycorrhizae, of course. Networks are known to be present in conifers, and they can share nutrients and other compounds through the mycorrhizae network under the ground. So it's no question that there's good evidence now, recent evidence to establish that nutrients and other compounds are shared among trees. And not only among conifers, conifers can share them with other types of deciduous trees as well, as long as they're within the mycorrhizae network.
Oh, that's so fascinating. It's amazing,
Yes.
Isn't it? I have another question here. Do you fertilize new plantings and later mature trees? And if so, what do you use? This person, Kathy, mentions—
Number one, I don't use fertilizer for conifers. I don't
Okay.
fertilize any of my conifers. The approach that we've taken for sustainable landscape best practices is to have healthy, fertile soil. And we do that by making sure the soil has a satisfactory amount of organic material. And then we let the microorganisms work on that organic material, and the microorganisms feed the conifers. We feed the microorganisms by how we handle the soil, and let the microorganisms do their work to feed the conifers. Generally, conifers do not need fertilizer added unless there's some depleted soil and nutrients. The most common example of that would be a fast draining sandy soil loses its nutrients readily. In that particular circumstances, it may be necessary to fertilize your conifer. A second example may be a conifer in a container, which has generally fast draining medium, and therefore the conifer in that circumstances may need fertilizer. But in the natural garden environment with good fertile soil, you normally are wasting your time and money by fertilizing, and they would actually do better by not adding fertilizer. The second point I want to make is that adding more fertilizer than needed can inhibit the mycorrhizae that conifer has, and that would have a negative impact on the growth and particularly the drought tolerance of that conifer, since mycorrhizae networks are very important for the drought tolerance of conifers. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it speaks a little bit to our first Christmas tree we had when my son was born was a live tree that we bought in a pot, and it was a sequoia. And it sat on our dresser, acting as the Christmas tree. And then we then planted it in our backyard in an urban area. And when we moved 15 years later, it was giant and threatening the fence next to our neighbor's fence. A beautiful tree. But a question I would ask is, what would be some conifers you would then suggest for smaller urban properties where maybe they don't have room for giant sequoia?
Well, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of dwarf conifers available. Even the dawn redwood and sequoias. I have a dwarf redwood in the redwood sanctuary, in addition to the very large one that's over 100 feet right now. We have a dwarf one that's been there a number of years, and it's no more than a foot tall. So you can find dwarf conifers many, many species that will not outgrow their space. Anywhere from less than an inch of year growth rate to 6 inches is considered a dwarf conifer. And there are many, many types available now, which was not true a number of years ago. I think there are new dwarf conifers being found all the time, and most dwarf conifers are derived from witch's brooms. Witch's brooms are congested growth on trees. Then cuttings or scions are grafted to the same or similar or related species, and that's how the dwarf conifers are produced. So the vast majority of the dwarf conifers that I have in my botanical garden are generated by witch's brooms. And those conifers are particularly suitable for smaller gardens because they grow slowly.
Well, and John, in my experience, a lot of nurseries now are grouping conifers so that you can, the ones that will go full size are over here, and then the ones that will stay miniature are on this table. So it pays to ask when you go to a nursery and maybe get some guidance as to where the miniatures are or the dwarfs.
Right, and it is very important to know the growth rate of your conifer, so you don't make this mistake you did, Sarah, by buying something that grows 4 feet a year, and then you find out it's outgrown its space.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a beautiful result, but yes, it was a little large for the space for sure. Something else people want to know here, particularly on the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sure it affects people other places, is looking for deer-resistant varieties. I've seen so many people try to put in like cedar hedges, and then the whole bottoms of them are eaten up about 4 or 5 feet. And so what could you suggest for people?
Well, we actually have a section on dealing with deer in the book. And I do have a lot of experience with this. For example, the redwood sanctuary that we bought, in the last few years, was outside the fence and exposed to deer every single day. And we did have selected dwarf conifers. Now, generally, deer do not browse dwarf conifers, but if they can get to the leader, they can rub their heads on the leader and remove the cambium. And if that happens, your conifer is dead. So you want to select conifers where the leader is not exposed, number one. And but the other problem, of course, deer can cause breakage. And because of that, in the last 2 weeks, we actually fenced the redwood sanctuary. So we have the option of growing other plants besides deer-resistant plants. But generally, dwarf conifers, where the leader is not exposed, the deer will not browse and generally don't bother, but they can cause breakage over time. And so there's nothing you can avoid there. But generally, the types of conifers that deer like, of course, you mentioned Taxus or yews, and there's a few others, arbor vitae, that they may browse on. But most of your drought-tolerant pines, spruces, cypresses, they are not going to browse on. And those particular types are listed in the book. So you want to make sure you pick the type they're less likely to browse on, and that will depend upon the type of deer and how hungry they are and what else is available, of course, in the environment. That also makes a difference.
Right, if they found my tomatoes first.
Deer will eat anything or browse on anything. That's the only food available. So that's the other thing to remember.
Okay, so feed the deer in a different way, or else.
Well, yeah, you can have a beautiful rose garden. They won't touch the deer. The roses that chew on. So that's another approach.
Another question we have is from Ina, and she's asking, are there any conifers for the desert near Palm Springs besides Joshua trees in higher elevations?
You mean what else is there?
Yeah, what else would you be able to plant at that higher elevation besides a Joshua tree?
Well, I think there are other pines and pines, of course, are one of the more drought tolerant. Junipers is another one, and maybe some spruces. But in that situation, they may need supplemental water. I know in the high elevation you have freezes, so you want to make sure they'll have hardiness, but I think that the temperatures are not going to be the determining factor. It's really water will make the difference. And I think there are many trees that are quite drought tolerant, such as pines and junipers and spruces and cedrus, for example. Those are 4 examples. Will do okay in the desert, provided they may need some supplemental water, particularly in the summertime.
David, did you have something to add there?
I was just going to remind him that she was talking about Palm Springs, which, gets up to 120 degrees on a regular basis in the summer. And that really limits the palette that you can work with of plants that can tolerate that sort of heat day in and day out for months at a time. Their winters would be like no problem, but the summer, that 120 degree heat, there will be a fairly limited number of trees. And again, most rather than going to a big box nursery, which isn't going to be nearly as eco-sensitive to its region, I would go to local nurseries in my area, and they would, if they're smart, they're buying plants that can tolerate their area, and they want return customers, so they're going to tell you the truth about what you need to do and what plants can handle what sort of situations.
The local situation, they would know the local situation. Yeah, I think Palm Springs, having been there a few times, is an extreme example. But I think in many other warm, dry climates that don't get quite as hot, there are many drought-tolerant conifers that would do fine, provided they had some supplemental water.
Okay, so for people wondering about like the soil, the health of the soil or the depth of the soil required, is conifer growth really dependent on soil health, or will that come after? I mean, you think of, a lot of the islands are shallow soil because they're on rocks, but yet we have lots of forests growing coniferous trees. So
no, soil is an important factor, the type of soil. So if you have very fast draining soil, well then you're going to have nutrient deficiencies and other issues, and certainly they would need more water.
But John, wouldn't you like? You've got conifers that can grow on sheer rock cliffs that don't really their water uptake systems are quite different than, say, like an eastern white pine that has a big taproot that goes straight down, right?
That's correct.
There are kinds of trees that can handle very thin soil and they thrive.
Absolutely.
That's their niche in the world.
Yes, that's correct. And there are a number of examples all over the world where there are conifers growing on cliffs and rocks. So in those circumstances, there are conifers adapted to those harsh conditions.
So I think about on the West Coast here, a lot of the tree planting that goes on in sort of slash sites, on clear-cut sites, people pounding in hundreds of trees a day. What would you say is the success rate of that kind of planting, generally speaking? Like especially if you're doing it, say, in the heat of the day, tree after tree, it's not necessarily conducive to transplanting a tree.
Absolutely. I think they should have much greater success if they did it at a different time period.
So in a cooler time of day.
I would recommend doing it when it's cool in the morning, and when in cloudy days is the time that I would recommend doing it.
So pretty much
not only the time of day, but the season is important.
Right.
So if they're actively growing, they go through a much bigger shock than if you do it when they're dormant. So conifers.
It's a really different thing to be planting a tree in your garden versus like commercial timber production, replanting a clear cut. you can give the tree that you're planting in your garden all kinds of tender loving care, but if you have to if each person that's scaling the hillsides through the stump forests has to plant 500 trees a day, those trees are not going to get much TLC on an individual basis.
Right.
So,
but the timing of that is important, because they're going to have get rain, etc.
So just true for any plant that you're transplanting in your garden, you want to reduce the shock level for those. So they're basically different animals, whether you're planting hundreds of trees a day or doing them in your backyard.
Yeah. Well, there you're generally just using bare root seedlings, and bare root seedlings is different than going from a container nursery grown plant.
Right.
And there's also B&B. So we discussed those three types of plantings. Bare root versus container grown versus B&B is all handled differently.
Okay, well, so this is
being bald burlap.
Right, barn burlap.
Okay, so this is an interesting question then from Jacqueline, asking. So it says you mentioned exposed roots during planting. I do a lot of planting. She's a landscaper, and I usually expose roots by cutting it into the root ball, which has often been contained for some time and is in the shape of the container. Cutting up a root ball to expose roots takes some time. I'm using a root pruning saw. Does this sound right to you? Also, if I can get the root ball into a bucket or wheelbarrow of water, if it's dry, I like to leave it there for half an hour or so. Does this sound correct?
Was he talking about ball and burlap, I assume? I'm not clear on that, but it is. Ball and burlap is a little bit different, but I do think it's important to, if you have roots, to untangle the roots, and any kinked roots, etc., you want to cut off, and you want to expose those roots to the native soil. And I think one problem with B&B is that they're generally hard clay, and they don't take up water well. So it's very important to moisten your conifer before you plan to plant it, regardless of where it's coming from.
Okay.
But that's particularly in the case of B&B, where it will not take up water readily.
Okay, so she just mentioned that she's specifically referring to containerized plants and not B&B.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. So
okay, well, containerized plants, generally you want to remove the fast draining soilless medium, so you can then spread the roots around and then plant them in native soil. And that procedure, step by step, is detailed in the book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I don't know if you have any last words before we end today. We really appreciated your time. And I have to say that many of the comments that we had coming up were about the beauty of the photos. So, and how beautiful all of the images are. And so I just wanted to make that note as well to you both. And to thank you for your time and for being with us for our last gardening series of the season. And we'll be starting up again in the fall with new fall books coming up. We have stuff about growing figs in cold climates. So look for that one coming up in September or October. Again, I'd like to remind people that you can receive a 25% discount for growing conifers until June 8th. On New Society's website using the code Conifers25. If you want to keep up with new books that we have coming up off press, to sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. And also, if you're looking to see how you can help to save some of the great conifers left in the world, particularly right now in southern Vancouver Island, where people are protesting to protect these great wonders of the world, please check out our blog today. We can't all go out there and be on the front lines, but we can all make phone calls and make our premier know how we're feeling about the situation out in the woods. So I thank you both very much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we've really enjoyed your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, and thanks everybody who joined us today.
Bye-bye.
Bye.